The morning Sallie Gentry buried the last of her father's savings in a coffee tin behind the well house was the same morning Silas Crane rode up her lane with foreclosure papers folded neat as a funeral shroud in his breast pocket. It was the spring of 1884, and the Montana Territory had not yet decided whether it loved the settlers who scratched at its soil, or meant to starve every last one of them out before winter came again. Sallie stood on the porch of the small clapboard house her father had built with his own 2 hands 6 years before, her chestnut hair pulled back beneath a faded blue bonnet, her chin lifted in the particular way of a woman who has already decided she will not cry in front of strangers, no matter what they say to her. "Miss Gentry," Silas Crane said, touching the brim of his black hat without any real courtesy in the gesture. He was a heavy man, soft in the hands, the kind who had never once in his life pulled a calf from a mother having trouble, and he sat his horse like he was afraid of dirtying his trousers. "I have come about your father's note." "My father has been dead 3 months, Mr. Crane," Sallie said. "I would think a man of your position could find a more decent hour to speak of debts than the very morning after his grave has settled. Business does not wait on grief, Miss Gentry, much as I might wish it did." He unfolded the papers with a rustle that seemed too loud in the quiet of the yard. "The note comes due the 1st of June, $400 plus what interest has accrued. If it is not paid in full, the bank will take possession of this land, the well, and all water rights attached to it." Sallie's stomach dropped, though she did not let it show on her face. $400 was more money than she had seen in her whole life put together, and Crane knew it. Everyone in Willow Creek knew that Thomas Gentry had died owing more than his small herd of cattle and his 80 acres of wheat and hay ground could ever repay. And everyone knew, too, that Silas Crane had been buying up notes across the valley for a year now, waiting for the day the Northern Pacific Spur line came through and made every acre with a good well worth 10 times what it once was. "I will have the money," Sallie said, though she had no earthly notion how. "I do hope so," Crane said, though his tone said the opposite. "It would be a shame to see a young woman alone lose everything her father worked for. Of course, there is another way. I have made you a fair offer to purchase the land outright at a fair price, and you might go live comfortable in Bozeman, or wherever you please." "I do not wish to live in Bozeman," Sallie said. "I wish to keep my father's land, Mr. Crane, and I will thank you to remember that this is still my home until the 1st of June, and I would ask you to get off it." Crane's mouth tightened, but he touched his hat again and turned his horse, and Sallie watched him go with her heart hammering beneath her calico dress, wondering how in the name of heaven she was going to find $400 in 6 weeks with nothing to sell but a milk cow, a wagon, and 40 head of cattle too thin from a hard winter to fetch a decent price at any market this side of Helena. She did not know, standing there in the cold spring wind, that the man who would change the whole shape of her life was at that very moment riding the fence line 2 miles east, mending a break where a bull had pushed through, and thinking of nothing more complicated than whether the creek would run high enough this year to fill the lower pasture. Orville Lawson was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders from 15 years of ranch work, with sun-creased eyes the color of good strong coffee, and a quiet way of speaking that made men trust him before they even knew why. He had inherited the Lawson spread from his father, who had come west from Ohio in the years just after the war, and he had built it since into the largest and best-run ranch in the whole valley. 4,000 acres of grass and timber and clean water, worked by a dozen hired hands who stayed with him year after year, because he paid fair wages and never once raised his voice in anger that any of them could recall. He had heard about Thomas Gentry's death from his foreman, a leathery old cowhand named Pete Hicks, and he had heard, too, that Silas Crane held the note on the Gentry place, and Orville did not much care for either piece of news. He had known Thomas Gentry as a decent, hard-working man who had come out from Missouri with nothing but a wagon, a rifle, and a daughter he loved more than his own life, and Orville did not like to think of that daughter losing everything to a man like Crane, who had never done an honest day's labor in his soft, pale hands. It was 3 days after Crane's visit that Orville rode into town to fetch supplies and saw Sallie Gentry standing outside Meacham's general store, arguing in a low, fierce voice with the storekeeper about a bill she could not yet pay. "I have always paid what I owe, Mr. Meacham," she was saying, "and I will pay this too, but I need another 2 weeks until I can sell some cattle." "I am sorry, Miss Gentry," Meacham said, not unkindly but firmly, "but I have my own family to feed, and Mr. Crane has told me he expects to be settling all the debts in this valley himself before long. I cannot extend more credit." Sally's face had gone pale beneath her bonnet, and Orville, without quite deciding to, found himself dismounting and walking toward them. "Put whatever she owes on my account, Meacham," he said. Both of them turned to look at him, Meacham with plain relief and Sallie with something far more complicated, a flash of gratitude that died almost as fast as it was born, replaced by a stubborn heat that colored her cheeks. "I did not ask for your help, Mr. Lawson," she said. "No, ma'am, you did not," Orville said, tipping his hat. "I offered it of my own accord. There is a difference." "The difference does not matter much to my pride," Sallie said. "I do not take charity, sir, from you or from anyone." Meacham cleared his throat and found something urgent to attend to behind his counter, leaving the two of them standing in the dusty street with the whole town, it seemed to Sallie, watching from beneath awnings and through shop windows. "It is not charity," Orville said, and there was something steady and unhurried in the way he said it, no pity in it at all, which was perhaps why she did not simply walk away from him then and there. "It is a debt I am glad to cover for a neighbor, same as I would want covered for me if the shoe were on the other foot. Your father sold me good hay 2 winters running when my own crop failed. I have not forgotten it." Sallie studied him, this rancher she had seen at a distance a dozen times but never truly spoken to, a man everyone in the valley seemed to speak well of, and she felt the fight in her chest ease just slightly, though her pride would not let it go entirely. "I do not need your charity, Mr. Lawson," she said, quieter now. "Charity is what folks give when they expect nothing back and think less of you for taking it. I have had enough of that kind of looking down since my father died, from men circling like it is already decided I cannot hold what is mine. What I need is not your money. I need your word, if you are willing to give it, that you will deal with me plainly and fairly, same as you would with any man in this valley. That is worth more to me than any dollar." Orville looked at her for a long moment, and something in his chest shifted at the sight of her, standing there in her worn dress with her back straight and her eyes bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. A woman fighting for everything she had left in the world with nothing but her own 2 hands and her stubborn heart. "Then you have my word, Miss Gentry," he said, "plain and fair for as long as you will have it. And the store bill. Consider it a loan between neighbors to be repaid whenever you are able at no interest and no charity attached to it at all," Orville said, and the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, not quite a smile but close to one. "Is that plain and fair enough for you?" Sallie felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she had been carrying since the morning Crane rode up her lane, and though she still did not entirely trust this feeling, she found herself nodding. "That will do, Mr. Lawson," she said. "That will do just fine." He gave both freely that day, his word, and in his own quiet way, his charity too, though he was careful from that day forward never to let it look like charity again, understanding without needing to be told twice that this was a woman who would rather starve than be pitied, but who would work herself to the bone beside a man she trusted. The weeks that followed brought a strange, tentative rhythm to Sallie's days. Orville did not come around often, understanding that too much attention would set the whole valley to gossiping and wound her pride besides, but he sent Pete Hicks over twice a week with an extra hired hand to help her with the branding and the fence work she could not manage alone, always framed as work traded for the hay she still had stacked in her barn from the previous summer, work that Orville insisted, plainly and without argument, that his ranch needed anyway. "Mr. Lawson says the Gentry hay is the sweetest in the valley," Pete told her one afternoon, grinning beneath his gray mustache as he coiled a length of rope, "and that it is worth a week of Jimmy's time to have first pick of it come fall." "Mr. Lawson is a terrible liar," Sallie said, though she could not keep the smile from her own face. "Terrible," Pete agreed cheerfully, "but he is honest about being terrible at it, which I suppose counts for something." It was in the third week of this arrangement that Orville himself came riding up her lane on a gray gelding, his hat pushed back, looking for all the world like a man who had simply happened to be passing by, though the Gentry place was a good 3 miles out of the way from anywhere he might have honest business. "Afternoon, Miss Gentry," he said, dismounting near the corral where she was working a young mare who had never taken a saddle. "That is a fine-looking animal." "She is a stubborn one," Sallie said, not looking up from where she stood with the lead rope, speaking low and steady to the trembling mare. "Stubborn as her owner, my father used to say." Orville leaned against the corral fence and watched her work for a while in companionable silence, and Sallie found she did not mind the audience, which surprised her, for she had grown used to minding a great many things since her father's death: the pity in the eyes of the church ladies, the calculation in the eyes of men like Crane, the awkward sympathy of neighbors who did not know what to say to a woman alone. Orville's eyes held none of that. He simply watched, with the quiet appreciation of a man who understood horses and knew good work when he saw it. "You have a gentle hand with her," he said finally. "Most men would have her fighting the bit by now, working her that hard." "My father taught me," Sallie said, and her voice caught only slightly on the word father. "He said there is no sense breaking an animal's spirit to get its obedience, said the same was true of people, though he did not always live by it when it came to me. He sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Sallie said. "Stubborn and proud, and he worked himself half to death trying to make this place pay, and in the end it was his heart that gave out, not the land that beat him, though I suppose it comes to the same thing." She finally looked up at Orville then, and there was a rawness in her eyes that she usually kept well hidden. "I do not know if I can hold on to it, Mr. Lawson. I do not know if I am strong enough." "You are the strongest woman I have met in this territory," Orville said, and he said it so simply, so without any flattery in it, that Sallie felt her throat tighten with an emotion she had not expected. "Strength is not about knowing you can win, Miss Gentry. It is about standing your ground even when you are not sure you can. I have watched you do that every single day since your father passed." Sallie looked away, blinking hard, and busied herself coiling the lead rope so he would not see her eyes shine. "You are not so bad at flattery as your foreman claims you are at lying, Mr. Lawson," she said, and Orville laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and Sallie found herself smiling despite everything, despite the debt hanging over her head like a storm cloud that refused to break. That laugh of his stayed with her long after he had ridden away that evening, and she found herself thinking of it while she lay awake that night listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods along the creek, wondering when exactly Orville Lawson had stopped being simply a neighbor with a fair reputation, and started being someone whose opinion of her mattered more than she was quite ready to admit. Spring wore on toward summer, and the valley came alive with the particular business of a ranching country in its busiest season having finished, branding underway, the grass greening up fast under warm rains, and everywhere the talk of the coming railroad spur, which some said would reach Willow Creek by autumn and others said would never come at all, and which Silas Crane, it was whispered, had staked his whole fortune on believing would come very soon indeed. Sallie worked from before dawn until well after dark, tending her cattle, mending fences, patching the roof where it had begun to leak, doing the work of 3 hired men because she could afford none, and slowly, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, Orville Lawson became a fixture in the rhythm of her days. He rode over most Sundays after church, always with some plain, practical reason, a spare part for her plow, a question about grazing rights along the creek that ran between their 2 properties, an invitation to a barn dance that he delivered with such careful casualness that Sallie knew He had rehearsed the words the whole ride over. "The Hendricks are putting up a new barn Saturday," he said, standing awkwardly by her porch rail with his hat in his hands, an unusual gesture for a man normally so at ease. "There will be a dance after once the frame is up. I thought you might want to come. Everyone will be there." "I have cattle to see to," Sallie said automatically, though the truth was she had finished her work an hour before and had simply been sitting on the porch enjoying the cool of the evening. "I could send Pete over Saturday morning to check your herd if that would ease your mind," Orville said. "It is no trouble, Mr. Lawson," Sallie said, with a small, knowing smile. "Are you inviting me to a dance, or are you simply looking for another excuse to send your foreman over to do my chores?" Orville's ears went faintly red beneath his hat, which Sallie found she liked seeing very much indeed, this big steady man who never seemed rattled by anything suddenly caught out like a boy. "I suppose I am inviting you to a dance, Miss Gentry," he admitted, "though I will confess the chores were a convenient excuse if you needed one." "I do not need excuses, Mr. Lawson," Sallie said, and she found to her own surprise that this was entirely true. "I will come to the dance. I have not danced since before my father passed. It might do me good." And so it was that on a warm Saturday evening in June, with the frame of the new Hendricks barn standing golden against a sky streaked orange and violet, Sallie Gentry found herself in Orville Lawson's arms for the first time, turning slow circles to the sound of a lone fiddle and the laughter of half the valley gathered around. And she thought, with a clarity that startled her, that she had not felt this steady, this safe, since long before her father died. "You dance well for a rancher," she said, teasing him, aware of how close his hand rested at her waist, aware of the warmth of him even through the fabric of her dress. "My mother insisted on it," Orville said. "She said a man who could not dance was a man who had never learned patience, and patience was the whole secret to ranching, so I had better learn both." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Orville said, and something shadowed past briefly behind his eyes. "She and my father both passed the same winter when I was 22. Diphtheria took them within a week of each other. I buried them both before the ground had even properly thawed, and I have run the ranch alone ever since." Sallie missed a step, surprised by this unexpected confession, and looked up at him with new understanding dawning in her eyes. "I did not know that," she said softly. "I am sorry, Orville." It was the first time she had called him by his given name, and they both seemed to notice it at the same moment, a small shift in the air between them. "It was a long time ago," he said. "But I know something of what you are carrying, Sallie. The weight of a place that was never truly yours until grief made it so. I know what it is to wonder some mornings if you have the strength to keep going and to find somehow that you do, because there is nothing else to be done but to keep going." "How did you bear it?" Sallie asked, and she was no longer teasing now, her voice small and honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "One day at a time," Orville said. "And I suppose, if I am honest, I bore it better once I stopped trying to bear it entirely alone." The music ended, but neither of them stepped back right away, and for a long moment they simply stood there in the lantern light, closer than propriety strictly allowed, and Sallie felt something new and frightening bloom in her chest, something she had not let herself feel in a very long time, not since before her mother died of the fever back in Missouri when Sallie was 16. Not since she had learned that loving people meant risking the unbearable pain of losing them. "I should get you some punch," Orville said finally, his voice a little rough, and Sallie nodded, grateful for the small mercy of a moment to collect herself, though she watched him walk away across the barnyard with a feeling that had nothing at all to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way her heart had begun, quite without her permission, to belong to Orville Lawson. But even as the summer deepened and the bond between them grew steady and sure, the shadow of Sela's Crane's deadline never lifted from Sallie's mind. She sold what cattle she could bear to part with at the Bozeman stockyards, working out the arrangement herself, riding 2 days each way with a hired drover Orville insisted on providing, though he was careful to frame it, once again, as a simple matter of shared trail costs rather than any favor. She scraped together every dollar she could, selling her mother's silver hairbrush, her father's good rifle, taking in mending from the ranch wives who could afford to pay for it. And still, by the third week of May, she had barely $200 set aside, with barely 2 weeks left before Crane's deadline arrived. It was on a hot, dry afternoon in the last week of May that the real trouble began, the kind of trouble that had nothing to do with pride or debts, and everything to do with the darker currents running beneath Silas Crane's soft, polite manner. Sallie woke before dawn to the smell of smoke and the frantic bawling of cattle, and she ran out in her nightdress to find that someone had cut the fence along her north pasture and driven off nearly a dozen head of her remaining herd in the night, leaving behind only the smoldering remains of a small fire set. It seemed, simply to spook the rest of the cattle into scattering across the open range. She stood in the gray light of dawn, staring at the broken fence and the tracks of unshod horses leading off toward the hills, and she felt a cold fury rise in her that was far sharper than her grief had been, because grief was something that simply happened to a person. But this was something someone had done to her, deliberately, cruelly, and she knew, with a certainty that needed no proof, exactly whose doing it was. She rode straight to the Lawson ranch, arriving just as the hands were finishing breakfast, her hair wild and unbound, her face streaked with dust and fury, and Orville came out of the ranch house at the sound of her horse's hooves, his own face going hard and dangerous the moment he saw her state. "Sallie, what has happened?" "Someone drove off a dozen head in the night and cut my fence to do it," she said, her voice shaking with anger she could barely contain. "I know it was Crane's men, Orville. Who else would benefit from ruining me before the 1st of June? Orville's jaw tightened, and for the first time since Sallie had known him, she saw a flash of real anger in his normally steady eyes. "We cannot prove it was Crane," he said, "but by God we can find your cattle. Pete, saddle up and get Jimmy and Frank too. We are riding out." By midday, a party of 6 men and Sallie herself, who refused to be left behind despite Orville's protests, had tracked the cattle through the foothills to a small box canyon, where they found the animals penned loosely behind a makeshift gate of brush and rope, unguarded, as though whoever had taken them had meant only to scatter and delay rather than truly steal, perhaps hoping the lost time and effort alone would break Sallie's resolve before the deadline arrived. "This was not theft," Orville said grimly, examining the tracks and the crude fence. "This was a warning. Crane wants you desperate, Sallie. He wants you so worn down and afraid that you sign his offer just to be rid of the whole business." "Then he does not know me very well," Sallie said, though her voice trembled slightly even as she said it, "because I would rather lose every cow I own than give that man the satisfaction." Orville looked at her for a long moment, the anger in his eyes giving way to something gentler, something fierce and protective in a way that made Sallie's breath catch. "You will not lose everything," he said. "I give you my word on that, same as I gave it to you in town that day. Whatever it takes, Sallie, I will not let Crane take what your father built." "You cannot fight my battles for me, Orville," Sallie said, though there was less certainty in it now than there had been in the general store weeks before. "I told you I do not want your charity." "This is not charity," Orville said, and his voice was low and rough with feeling. "Charity is a coin tossed to a stranger. This is a man standing beside the woman he has come to love because he cannot do otherwise, whatever pride tells either of us it ought to look like." The word love hung between them in the dusty canyon air, unplanned, unrehearsed, more honest than either of them had meant to be in that moment. And Sallie felt her heart stop and then start again, painfully, wonderfully. "You love me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "I believe I have for some weeks now," Orville said, "though I confess I have been a coward about saying it plainly, on account of not wanting you to think I said it merely to win an argument about charity." Sallie laughed then, a sound half sob and half genuine joy, and she closed the distance between them without any further hesitation, and Orville met her halfway. And there in the shadow of the canyon walls, with the recovered cattle lowing softly behind them and the other men tactfully occupied with rounding up strays, Orville Lawson kissed Sallie Gentry for the first time, and it was nothing like charity at all. It was a promise, freely given and freely received. The kind that asked for nothing in return but the same honesty offered back. "I love you too," Sallie said against his mouth, laughing and crying both at once. "I have for weeks, and I have been too stubborn and too frightened to say it." "Then we are a matched pair of fools," Orville said, "though I think perhaps the best kind." They rode back to the Gentry ranch with the cattle driven safely before them, and though the trouble with Crane was far from over, something had settled between Sallie and Orville that afternoon that neither Silas Crane nor all the debts in the territory could unsettle again. But love, however true, does not pay a note due at the bank, and the days ticked steadily toward the 1st of June, with a relentlessness that no amount of tenderness between them could slow. It was Pete Hicks, in the end, who brought the idea that changed everything, sitting at the Lawson kitchen table one evening with a cup of strong black coffee and a look on his weathered face like a man who had been chewing on a thought for some time before deciding to spit it out. "You know," Pete said slowly, "there is more than one way to skin a cat, and more than one way to settle a debt too. Seems to me if Crane bought that note fair and square from the bank, there is nothing stopping another man from buying it right back off him, provided he offers a fair price, and Crane is fool enough to think he is getting a good deal." Orville set down his own coffee cup, considering this. "Crane will not sell easily if he thinks the water rights are worth 10 times what the note is worth once the railroad comes through." "No," Pete agreed, "but Crane is a proud man too, in his own way, and prouder men than him have made foolish trades when they thought they were being clever. What if he did not know it was you buying, Mr. Lawson? What if he thought some fellow from Helena wanted the note just to speculate on it himself, offered a price a bit above what Crane paid, enough to turn a tidy profit without the trouble of foreclosing on a homestead and stirring up the whole valley against him? Crane cares more for his reputation with the railroad men than he does for one small parcel of land, if he thinks he can turn a quicker profit elsewhere." Orville's eyes brightened with the first real hope Sallie had seen in him since the cattle had been driven off. "You are a devious old man, Pete Hicks," he said, "and I believe I love you for it. Do we know anyone in Helena we could trust to make such an offer on our behalf?" "My brother-in-law does business up there," Pete said, allowing himself a small, satisfied smile. "He owes me a favor or two, and he is not above playing the part of a speculator for an afternoon if the price is right." It took 2 more weeks of careful, quiet arrangement, letters sent by fast rider to Helena and back, a tense negotiation carried out entirely through intermediaries so that Crane would never suspect the truth, and all the while Sallie lived with her heart in her throat, torn between hope and the fear that it would all collapse before the deadline arrived. Orville came to see her nearly every evening during those weeks, not to speak of the plan, which was too delicate and too uncertain to discuss aloud more than necessary, but simply to sit with her on the porch as the sun went down, to hold her hand and remind her, in his steady, quiet way, that whatever happened, she would not face it alone. "I keep thinking," Sallie said one evening, her head resting against his shoulder as the fireflies began to rise from the tall grass along the creek, "that even if this works, even if we manage to buy back the note, I will still owe someone that $400, plus whatever price this scheme costs. I will simply have traded one debt for another." "You will owe it to me," Orville said simply, "and I will tell you now what I intend to do about that debt, so there is no confusion later and no chance for your pride to make a fuss about it. I intend to ask you to marry me, Sallie Gentry, and when you say yes, as I dearly hope you will, the debt will simply cease to exist, because there can be no debt between a husband and wife, only a shared life and shared land and shared everything else besides." Sallie sat up straight, staring at him in the fading light, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. "Orville Lawson, is that your idea of a proper proposal?" "I confess I had planned something a bit more romantic," Orville admitted, a sheepish grin breaking across his face, "involving perhaps a ring and getting down on one knee, and words a good deal more poetic than talk of debts and pride. But you have caught me at an honest moment, and I find I would rather ask you honestly and badly than wait for some perfect moment that may never come. So I am asking you plainly, Sallie, with no charity and no debts between us at all, only my whole heart freely given. Will you marry me?" Sallie felt the tears come then, the ones she had held back through months of grief and fear and stubborn pride, and she did not try to stop them now, because they were tears of a different kind entirely. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying together. "Yes, Orville, I will marry you, though I insist you still get down on one knee at some point before the wedding, because a woman deserves at least one properly poetic proposal in her life, even if it comes after she has already said yes." Orville laughed, a full, joyous sound that carried across the darkening yard, and he did get down on one knee then, right there on the porch steps, and produced from his coat pocket a small ring that had belonged to his own mother, a thin gold band with a small, honest garnet stone that caught what little light remained in the sky. "Sallie Gentry," he said, taking her hand in both of his, "you are the bravest, most stubborn, most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I would be honored beyond anything I can say if you would wear my mother's ring and become my wife." "Yes," Sallie said again, softer this time, and let him slide the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her all along. The plan worked exactly as Pete Hicks had predicted. Silas Crane, delighted at the prospect of a quick profit from an eager speculator up in Helena, sold the note for a price that turned him a tidy sum above what he had originally paid, congratulating himself all the while on his shrewdness, entirely unaware that the money had come, by a circuitous route through Pete's brother-in-law, directly from Orville Lawson's own savings. When the papers were finally transferred and the truth came out, for such things could not remain secret long in a valley where everyone knew everyone else's business, Crane's fury was a thing to behold, but there was nothing at all he could legally do about a sale he had entered into willingly and profitably. He rode out to the Gentry place one last time in the second week of June, his face red with impotent anger, to find Sallie and Orville standing together on the porch, her hand resting easily in his, and he understood in that moment, looking at the two of them, that he had lost far more than a piece of land. "You think you have won something, Miss Gentry," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "but you will find that the railroad men do not take kindly to being thwarted, and there will be other ways to make trouble for a small ranch that stands in the way of progress. Mr. Crane," Orville said, stepping slightly forward, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of warning, "the note is settled, the land is Miss Gentry's own, free and clear, and come autumn it will be mine to share as her husband. I would advise you to consider very carefully whether you wish to make an enemy of every rancher in this valley who has watched you try to bleed a grieving young woman dry these past months. There are a good many of us, and we do not forget who our friends are, nor who our enemies have shown themselves to be." Crane looked around, perhaps for the first time truly seeing the way the valley had quietly closed ranks around Sallie Gentry, the way Orville Lawson's reputation and influence had woven a protection around her that his money alone could not overcome, and something in his bluster deflated. "This is not the last you will hear of the railroad's plans for this valley," he said, though the threat had lost most of its force. "No," Orville agreed, "I do not suppose it is. But it is the last you will trouble Sallie Gentry, or I promise you, Silas, you will find every door in Willow Creek closed to you, and every honest man's hand withheld from yours, for as long as you both shall live in this territory." Crane rode away that day and did not return, and though he remained in the valley some years more, buying and selling and speculating as men of his nature always do, He never again tried to trouble Sallie Gentry or the man who had become her fiercest protector. The wedding took place on a golden afternoon in late August, in the small white church at the edge of Willow Creek, with nearly the whole valley in attendance. For by then everyone knew the story of the proud young woman who had refused charity and demanded only honesty, and the rancher who had given her both, freely and without reservation. Sallie wore a dress of pale blue cotton that had been her mother's, taken in and altered by the same church ladies whose pity she had once resented, and whose genuine friendship she had come, in the months since, to value deeply. Orville stood at the front of the church in his best dark suit, looking, Pete Hicks observed to anyone who would listen, about as nervous as a man facing a stampede, though his face broke into the widest smile anyone in the valley had ever seen the moment Sallie appeared at the church door on the arm of old Reverend Thomas, who had known her father and had insisted, when she confessed she had no one to walk her down the aisle, that he would be honored to do it himself. "Thomas Gentry would be so proud of you," the old Reverend whispered to her as they walked, and Sallie felt her father's presence in that moment as surely as if he had been standing there himself, and she found she was smiling through her tears rather than simply crying. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, the vows spoken plainly and without embellishment, in keeping with the character of the two people making them. When Reverend Thomas asked Orville if he would take Sallie as his wife, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, Orville's voice rang out clear and sure across the small church. "I will," he said, "and I will add to that, for whatever it is worth before God and this whole valley as witness, that I will always deal with her plainly and fairly, same as I promised the very first day I met her, for as long as we both shall live." There was a soft ripple of laughter through the congregation at this, for the story of that first meeting outside Meacham's store had become something of a local legend already, told and retold with growing embellishment at every gathering that summer, and Sallie laughed too, through her happy tears, and when it came her turn to speak her vows, she added her own addition. "And I will add," she said, "that I take back every word I ever said about not needing this man's charity, because I have come to understand that what he offers is not charity at all, but love, freely given, and I intend to spend the rest of my life giving it back to him in equal measure, freely and without keeping any kind of count." The wedding feast afterward filled the churchyard and spilled out into the street beyond, with tables of food brought by nearly every family in the valley, and music from 3 fiddles and an accordion that played long into the warm summer evening. And Sallie and Orville danced beneath the same stars that had watched over that first dance at the Hendricks barn raising, though this time there was no uncertainty left between them at all, only the deep, settled joy of two people who had found, against considerable odds, exactly where they belonged. The years that followed were not without their hardships, for the Montana Territory was never an easy place to make a life, but they were hardships faced together, and that made all the difference in the world. The railroad spur did come through eventually, in the autumn of 1886, though it passed a full 3 miles south of the combined Lawson and Gentry lands, and whatever grand designs Sila's Crane had harbored for the water rights along Willow Creek came to nothing when the railroad company chose a different route entirely, one that made his careful speculation worthless and sent him, within 2 years, to try his fortunes in some other territory altogether. A small and quiet justice that the whole valley took some satisfaction in, though none more than Sallie herself. Sallie and Orville combined their 2 ranches into one great spread that came to be known simply as the Lawson Gentry Ranch, a name Orville insisted upon over Sallie's initial protests that her father's name need not be attached alongside his own. "Your father built something worth remembering, Sallie," he told her, "and I will not have his name forgotten simply because mine happened to be larger when we joined our lives together. This land is as much his legacy as it is my inheritance, and our children will grow up knowing both names and both stories." Their first child, a son, was born in the spring of 1885, not quite 9 months after the wedding, a fact that set the church ladies to counting on their fingers with knowing smiles, though Sallie only laughed when she heard of the gossip and did not trouble herself to explain that the counting came out perfectly respectable in the end. They named him Thomas after Sallie's father, and he grew up sturdy and stubborn, with his mother's chestnut hair and his father's steady brown eyes. And by the time he was 5 years old, he could already sit a horse better than most grown men, much to Orville's quiet pride. Their second child arrived 2 years later, a daughter they named Margaret after Orville's own mother, a bright, curious girl who took after her mother's fierce independence from nearly the moment she could walk, insisting by the age of 4 that she would learn to rope cattle just the same as her older brother, a demand that Orville, remembering the proud, capable young woman he had fallen in love with, could hardly refuse. A third child followed in 1889, another son they named William, and by then the Lawson Gentry Ranch had grown to encompass nearly 7,000 acres, one of the largest and most respected operations in the whole valley, known not only for the quality of its cattle, but for the fairness with which Orville and Sallie together dealt with every hired hand, every neighbor, every trader who came through Willow Creek looking to do honest business. Pete Hicks stayed on as foreman until he was well past 60, finally retiring to a small cabin on the property that Orville built for him with his own hands as a wedding gift of sorts, though Pete insisted it was payment enough simply to have lived to see young Thomas Lawson grow tall enough to ride the fence line without his father's help. He was there, sitting in a place of honor, when young Thomas himself married a rancher's daughter from over toward Bozeman in the summer of 1905, and he liked to tell anyone who would listen the whole story of how it had all begun, of a proud young woman standing on her porch refusing charity, and a steady young rancher who had given her his word instead, and how the two things, word and charity both, had turned out in the end to be exactly the same thing, when they came from a heart that loved without condition. Sallie herself, in the quiet evenings of her later years, would often sit on the porch of the ranch house that she and Orville had built together, expanded twice over the decades to accommodate their growing family, and think back on that hard, frightening spring of 1884 with a kind of tender gratitude that she had never expected to feel toward such a difficult season of her life. She would think of her father, gone now more than 20 years but never truly absent from the land he had first broken with his own hands, and she would think of Silas Crane, whom she had long since stopped feeling any bitterness toward, understanding that his cruelty, however painful at the time, had been the very thing that had brought Orville riding to her aid that morning at Meacham's store. "Do you ever wonder," she asked Orville once, many years later, both of them gray now but still holding hands on the porch swing the way they had when they were young, "what would have become of me if you had simply paid that bill and walked away, and I had let you, instead of demanding your word?" "I expect you would have found some other way to save this place," Orville said, "because you were the strongest woman in this territory long before I ever came along, and you would have remained so whether I had a hand in it or not. But I am grateful every single day of my life that I did not have to find out, and that you gave me the chance to give you my word, and that somewhere along the way, you decided to accept my heart as well, even though you swore up and down you would never accept charity from anyone. I still maintain," Sallie said, laughing, "that love is not charity, no matter how many times you tried to disguise it as such that first summer." "No," Orville agreed, pulling her closer against his shoulder as the sun set gold and rose over the vast rolling grasslands that stretched from horizon to horizon, land that held both their names now, and would hold the names of their children and grandchildren for generations after them. "Love is not charity at all. It is the one debt that grows richer the more freely it is given, and the one promise that never runs due because it is paid every single day, in full, for as long as two hearts are willing to keep giving it." They sat together as the stars came out over Willow Creek, the same stars that had watched a stubborn, grieving young woman refuse a rancher's charity and demand only his honest word, and had watched that same rancher give her both, freely, without hesitation, and had gone on watching, night after night, year after year, as that single act of fairness bloomed into a lifetime of love neither of them had ever thought to hope for. Back on that hard spring morning, when $400 and foreclosure notice had seemed like the whole of the world's cruelty, and neither of them could have imagined the whole world's kindness waiting just behind it. In the town of Willow Creek, which grew over the following decades into a proper small city with its own newspaper and its own modest college, the story of Sallie Gentry and Orville Lawson became something of a local legend, told to newcomers and children alike, as an example of what the territory could offer to those brave enough and honest enough to build something lasting from hardship. The little church where they had married still stood at the heart of the town long after both of them had gone gray, its white steeple visible for miles across the valley. And it was there, on their 50th wedding anniversary in the summer of 1934, that their whole family gathered, 3 children grown with families of their own, 11 grandchildren, and by then 2 great-grandchildren besides, to celebrate the 2 people who had taught them all, in ways large and small. That pride and love need never stand in opposition to one another, that a person could ask for exactly what they needed without shame, and that the finest gifts in life were never the ones given out of pity, but always the ones given freely, from a heart that asked nothing in return but the simple honesty of being loved in kind. Orville stood before the gathered family that day, older now, his once dark hair gone entirely silver, his hands weathered by more than 50 years of ranch work, and he raised a glass of lemonade, for he had never much cared for spirits, and looked at Sallie, who sat beside him with their great-granddaughter on her lap, and he said the same words he had said to her on their wedding day, all those years before. "I promised you plain dealing and fairness the very first day we met," he said, his voice thick with the accumulated weight of a lifetime of love, "and I have tried every day since to keep that promise. But I want you all to know, my whole family, gathered here today, that the truth of it was always something more than fairness. It was love. From the very first moment I saw her standing on that porch, refusing to be pitied, and I have counted myself the most fortunate man in this whole territory every single day since, that she agreed to let me love her." Sallie, her own hair silver now too, but her eyes as bright and stubborn as they had ever been, reached over and took his weathered hand in her own. "And I have counted myself fortunate," she said, "that I found a man who understood the difference between charity and love, and who gave me both freely, when I asked only for one." The family gathered around them, 3 generations strong, and the valley outside the church windows stretched green and golden in the summer light, the same land that Thomas Gentry had first broken with his own hands, the same land that Orville Lawson had joined to it in love rather than conquest, the same land that now held the bones and the memories and the enduring legacy of a love story that had begun with a debt and ended, 50 years later, with nothing owed between them at all. Only everything freely given and everything freely received, for as long as they both had lived, and for as long as their family would carry the story forward into whatever years the territory, now grown into a proper state, still had left to offer them. And if you had asked anyone in Willow Creek, even decades later, what they remembered most about Sallie Gentry and Orville Lawson, they would not have spoken first of the ranch they built, vast and prosperous as it became, nor of the children and grandchildren who carried their names proudly into the new century. They would have spoken, instead of a single moment on a dusty street outside a general store, of a young woman's stubborn pride and a young rancher's quiet honor, of 4 simple words that had somehow contained within them the whole shape of a love that would last a lifetime. "I do not need charity, only your word, and of how, in the end, the rancher had found a way to give her both, so completely and so freely that she had never again had cause to wonder which one she was receiving, because in his hands they had always, from that very first day, been exactly the same thing,